At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, Alexander Akimov pressed the emergency shutdown button at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It was supposed to save the reactor. Instead, it triggered a chain reaction that would kill thousands, force the permanent evacuation of an entire city, contaminate most of Europe with radioactive fallout, and ultimately contribute to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. 7 seconds after Akimov pressed that button, the reactor exploded with the force of a bomb. A second explosion followed immediately. The 1,000-ton steel and concrete lid of the reactor was blown completely off, shooting straight up into the night sky like a bottle cap before crashing back down at an angle. A massive fireball erupted from the core, climbing hundreds of feet into the air. And from the exposed reactor core, radiation began pouring into the atmosphere at levels never seen before in human history. This is the story of Chernobyl, the worst nuclear disaster in history. The accident that the nuclear power industry said could never happen. The catastrophe that killed dozens immediately, thousands more in the years that followed, and will continue affecting millions of people for decades to come. The disaster that made an entire region uninhabitable for 20,000 years. The V.I. Lenin nuclear power station, located near the town of Pripyat in northern Ukraine, was one of the Soviet Union's pride and joy facilities. Built starting in the 1970s along the Pripyat River about 65 miles north of Kiev, the plant had 4 RBMK-1000 nuclear reactors. Each reactor could produce 1,000 megawatts of electrical power. By 1986, all 4 reactors were operational, providing electricity to millions of Soviet citizens. The RBMK reactor design was uniquely Soviet. No other country used this type of reactor. It was big, powerful, and relatively cheap to build. But it had a critical design flaw that Western nuclear engineers had identified years earlier. Under certain conditions, particularly at low power levels, the RBMK reactor became unstable. If power began to rise, the reactor's design actually accelerated that rise rather than dampening it. This was called a positive void coefficient. It meant the reactor could spiral out of control very quickly. Soviet engineers knew about this flaw, but they believed their safety systems and operator training would prevent any problems. They were wrong. Pripyat was built specifically to house the workers of the Chernobyl plant and their families. Founded in 1970, by 1986 it had grown to a population of nearly 50,000 people. It was a model Soviet city. Wide boulevards, apartment blocks, schools and hospitals, a cultural center, sports facilities, an amusement park with a Ferris wheel that was scheduled to open on May 1st for May Day celebrations. The residents of Pripyat were mostly young families. The average age in the city was only 26. These were the elite workers of the Soviet nuclear program, living comfortable lives in a modern city. On April 25, 1986, the operators at reactor number 4 began preparing for a safety test. The test was designed to answer an important question. If the plant lost external electrical power, could the reactor's turbines, while spinning down, generate enough electricity to keep the emergency cooling pumps running until the backup diesel generators kicked in? It was a legitimate safety concern, and the test had been attempted before but never successfully completed. The test was scheduled for the afternoon. But due to demand for electricity, the Regional Power Authority asked Chernobyl to delay shutting down Reactor 4 until after peak evening hours. The test was postponed. By the time they actually started the test, it was after midnight. A different shift of operators had come on duty. These men had not been briefed on the test procedures as thoroughly as the day shift. And crucially, several of the most experienced senior operators were not present. The Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov was in charge of the test. Dyatlov was experienced but also known for being aggressive, intimidating, and unwilling to accept criticism. When things started going wrong, his personality would make the disaster worse. To run the test, the operators needed to reduce the reactor's power from its normal operating level of 3,200 megawatts thermal down to between 700 and 1,000 megawatts. They began reducing power around 1 a.m. But something went wrong. Instead of stabilizing at 700 megawatts, the power dropped too far, all the way down to just 30 megawatts. The reactor was barely producing any power at all. This should have been a red flag. At such low power, the reactor became dangerously unstable. The correct action would have been to abort the test, shut down the reactor completely, and wait. But Dyatlov insisted they continue. He ordered the operators to bring the power back up without shutting down first. This was against protocols. But Dyatlov was the boss and the operators followed his orders. They began withdrawing control rods from the reactor core to increase power. Control rods absorb neutrons and regulate the nuclear reaction. Pulling them out allows more reaction, more heat, more power. Soviet safety regulations required that at least 30 control rods remain inserted at all times to maintain control. The operators violated this rule. They pulled out nearly all the control rods, leaving only 6 to 8 inserted. The reactor was now in an extremely dangerous configuration. The power began to rise slowly. By 1 a.m., they had it up to 200 megawatts. It wasn't enough for the test, but Dyatlov decided to proceed anyway. At 1:03 a.m., they shut off the emergency core cooling system. This was part of the test protocol, simulating a loss of coolant. But it also removed one of the reactor's key safety systems. At 1:07 a.m., they activated additional coolant pumps to maximum flow. This was supposed to simulate what would happen if the main pumps failed and the turbines had to power the backup pumps. But the high water flow rate through the hot reactor core caused problems. Steam bubbles formed in the cooling channels. And because of that positive void coefficient design flaw, steam bubbles actually increased reactivity. More steam meant more power. More power meant more steam. A feedback loop was beginning. Warning alarms went off. Computer printouts showed dangerous conditions. Multiple indicators told the operators they should shut down immediately. But the test was underway. Dyatlov wanted to complete it. The operators ignored the warnings and continued. At 1:22 a.m., they began the actual test. They closed the valves to the turbines, simulating a loss of electrical power. The turbines began spinning down. The emergency pumps kicked in, powered by the dying turbines. This was exactly what they wanted to test. Would it work? For 36 seconds, it seemed like the test was going fine. The pumps were running. The reactor was stable at low power. Then, at 1:23 and 40 seconds a.m., Alexander Akimov noticed that power was beginning to rise rapidly. The reactor was going out of control. He hit the emergency shutdown button, activating the AZ-5 scram system. This was supposed to drop all the control rods back into the core simultaneously, shutting down the nuclear reaction instantly. But there was another design flaw in the RBMK reactor that nobody fully understood. The tips of the control rods were made of graphite, a material that actually increases reactivity for the first few seconds as the rods enter the core. Only after the rods were fully inserted would they absorb neutrons and shut down the reaction. This was called the positive scram effect. When Akimov hit AZ-5, the control rods began descending into the core. But with the reactor already unstable and power rising rapidly, those graphite tips caused a massive power surge. In less than 5 seconds, the reactor went from 200 megawatts to over 33,000 megawatts, far beyond its maximum design capacity. The fuel rods shattered. The cooling water flashed instantly to steam. The pressure was enormous, far more than the reactor vessel could handle. At 1:23 and 47 seconds a.m., just 7 seconds after Akimov pressed the button, Reactor 4 exploded. The explosion was not nuclear in the atomic bomb sense. It was a steam explosion, caused by superheated water turning to steam with such violence that it had the force of a bomb. But the result was catastrophic. The reactor vessel ruptured. Fuel fragments, graphite blocks, and radioactive materials were blown out of the core. The 1,000-ton upper biological shield, a massive steel and concrete lid, was lifted straight up by the force of the explosion and crashed back down at an angle, partially covering the ruined reactor. A second explosion followed immediately. Some believe it was another steam explosion. Others think it was a chemical explosion caused by hydrogen gas. Regardless, the second blast completed the destruction of Reactor 4. The core was now completely exposed to the open air. And from that exposed core, a pillar of superheated radioactive gas and particles began rising into the night sky. The graphite moderator blocks in the core, now exposed to oxygen, caught fire. Graphite burns extremely hot. The fire created convection currents that carried radioactive material high into the atmosphere. It was like a radioactive volcano, spewing poison into the sky. The two explosions killed 2 men instantly. Valery Kodomchuk was in the reactor hall when it exploded. His body was never recovered, entombed somewhere in the wreckage. Vladimir Shashanok was in another part of the building. He was found badly injured and died hours later. But those 2 deaths were just the beginning. Because from the moment the reactor exploded, everyone nearby was being exposed to lethal amounts of radiation. Firefighters arrived within minutes. They had no idea what they were walking into. Nobody told them the reactor core was exposed. They thought it was just a regular fire. They climbed onto the roof of the turbine hall and reactor building, directly above the burning core. They were breathing in radioactive smoke. Their boots were melting from the heat. And they were being hit with radiation so intense it would kill many of them within weeks. Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik led the first firefighting crew. He and his men spent hours on those roofs, dousing flames, preventing the fire from spreading to Reactor 3 next door. The radiation was so intense it changed the color of Pravik's eyes from brown to blue. All of the men on that roof received lethal doses. Pravik died 18 days later from acute radiation syndrome. His skin turned black. His organs failed one by one. The doctors could do nothing. By dawn, the fires on the roofs and in the surrounding buildings were extinguished. But the fire in the reactor core itself continued to burn. And every hour it burned, more radiation poured into the sky. The operators and engineers inside the plant were in denial. Despite clear evidence that the reactor had been destroyed, despite radiation readings that were off the scale, many refused to believe it. Dyatlov insisted the reactor was intact. The reactor core is intact, he told plant director Viktor Brukhanov. Someone measured radiation at 3.6 Roentgen per hour outside the plant and reported it. Not great, not terrible, a supervisor said. That reading became darkly famous. It was catastrophically wrong. The actual radiation levels were thousands of times higher. The dosimeters being used could only read up to 3.6 Roentgen. They'd maxed out immediately. The real levels were over 20,000 Roentgen per hour in some areas near the reactor. Across Pripyat, just 2 miles from the plant, residents had heard the explosions and seen the fires. Some went to the railway bridge near the plant to watch. From there, they had a clear view of the burning reactor. They saw a beautiful blue glow in the sky above the plant. That glow was Cherenkov radiation, caused by charged particles traveling faster than the speed of light in air. It's often described as beautiful. It was also deadly. Everyone on that bridge was exposed to massive radiation. Many later died. The bridge became known as the Bridge of Death. Throughout the day on April 26th, life in Pripyat continued almost normally. Children went to school. People went to work. Weddings were held. Nobody evacuated. Nobody was warned. The Soviet authorities didn't want to cause panic. They were still assessing the situation. And critically, they were trying to hide the disaster from the world. But you can't hide a nuclear disaster. Not when it's spewing radiation across Europe. 2 days after the explosion, on April 28th, workers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, over 800 miles away, detected elevated radiation levels. They initially thought there was a leak at their own facility. But after checking their plant and finding nothing wrong, they realized the radiation was coming from outside. They plotted wind patterns and traced the source to somewhere in the Soviet Union. Sweden demanded answers. Other European countries were now detecting the radioactive cloud. Finally, with the world demanding explanations, the Soviet Union admitted on the evening of April 28th that there had been an accident at Chernobyl. The announcement was brief and vague. It claimed casualties were minimal and the situation was under control. Both statements were lies. On April 27th, 36 hours after the explosion, Pripyat was finally evacuated. Buses arrived from Kiev. Residents were told they'd be gone for 3 days. Bring only essential items. Leave everything else. You'll be back soon. Most people believed it. They left their apartments full of possessions, photos on the walls, dishes in the cupboards. Many left pets behind, assuming they'd return in a few days to get them. They never came back. Pripyat remains abandoned to this day. Those 3 days turned into forever. Over 50,000 people were evacuated from Pripyat in just a few hours. But many had already been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation, particularly children, who are more vulnerable to radiation's effects. In the years and decades that followed, thousands would develop thyroid cancer from radioactive iodine they'd inhaled or consumed in contaminated milk during those crucial first days. Meanwhile, at the plant, the battle to contain the disaster was just beginning. The reactor was still burning. Radiation was still pouring into the atmosphere. And Soviet authorities realized they had to stop it at any cost. They began helicopter drops. Pilots flew directly over the burning reactor and dropped thousands of tons of sand, clay, lead, and boron onto the fire. The goal was to smother the flames and absorb radiation. The pilots were flying through clouds of radioactive smoke. Many received lethal doses. But they kept flying, mission after mission, day after day. The drops continued for 10 days. Over 5,000 tons of material were dropped onto Reactor 4. Eventually, on May 6, the fire in the core finally died down. But the threat wasn't over. Far from it. Engineers realized there was molten nuclear fuel, called corium, somewhere deep in the reactor building. This material was incredibly hot and incredibly radioactive. If it reached the water in the basement pools under the reactor, it could cause a massive steam explosion that would destroy the entire facility, including the 3 other reactors, and spread even more radiation. It would make the disaster incomparably worse. To prevent this, someone had to drain the water from those basement pools. And the valves to drain them were in a flooded basement, in complete darkness, deep under the destroyed reactor. In one of the most radioactive environments on Earth. 3 men volunteered. Alexei Ananenko and Valery Bespalov, both engineers who knew the plant layout, and Boris Baranov, who operated the flashlight. On May 4th, these 3 men put on wetsuits, took a flashlight and a dosimeter, and waded into the flooded basement. They navigated through pitch-black corridors, water up to their waists, searching for the valves. The radiation was so intense their dosimeters were screaming. But they found the valves and opened them. The pools drained. The crisis was averted. For years, it was believed all 3 men died from radiation exposure within days or weeks. This became part of the Chernobyl legend, the suicide mission that saved Europe. But it was partly a myth. All 3 survived the mission. Ananenko and Bespalov lived for years afterward. Baranov did die in 2005, but from a heart attack, not acute radiation syndrome. Still, what they did was extraordinarily brave. They knew the risks and went anyway. The Soviet Union mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers for the Chernobyl cleanup. They were called liquidators. Soldiers, coal miners, construction workers, engineers, scientists, all drafted to deal with the disaster. Their jobs varied. Some cleared radioactive debris from the roof of Reactor 3. Some drove armored vehicles to push the most contaminated wreckage. Some built what would become known as the sarcophagus, a massive steel and concrete structure to entomb the destroyed reactor. The roof clearing was particularly horrific. Radiation levels on parts of the roof were so high that machines stopped working. Electronics were fried by the radiation. Robots sent up to clear debris simply died. So the Soviets used men instead. Biorobots, they called them. These liquidators, wearing makeshift lead aprons, were sent onto the roof in shifts. They had 40 seconds. That's all the time they could safely spend up there before receiving a lethal dose. 40 seconds to run out, shovel radioactive graphite over the side, and run back. Some men made multiple trips. The radiation was so intense you could taste metal in your mouth. You felt dizzy and nauseous within seconds. But they kept going. Thousands of men, 40 seconds at a time, until the roof was clear. Over 600,000 liquidators worked at Chernobyl between 1986 and 1990. Many received doses far exceeding safe limits. Official Soviet records claimed only 31 people died as a direct result of Chernobyl. This number is widely disputed. It only counts acute radiation deaths in the immediate aftermath. It doesn't include the thousands who died later from radiation-induced cancers and other illnesses. Independent estimates of the total death toll range from 4,000 to over 90,000, depending on how deaths are attributed. The sarcophagus was built in just 206 days, a remarkable feat of engineering under terrible conditions. Workers could only be on site for limited times due to radiation. The structure had to be built quickly before winter, and it had to contain the shattered reactor and its radioactive contents. The result was a massive steel and concrete shell that covered the entire reactor building. It wasn't perfect. It leaked. But it stopped the worst of the radiation from escaping. The evacuations continued expanding. Eventually, a 30-kilometer exclusion zone was established around Chernobyl. Over 350,000 people were permanently relocated. Entire villages and towns were abandoned. Pripyat, Chernobyl town itself, farms, schools, forests, all deemed too contaminated to inhabit. The radiation spread far beyond Ukraine. Belarus took 70% of the fallout. Radioactive rain fell across Europe. Iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90, and other dangerous isotopes contaminated crops, milk, meat. Countries thousands of miles away had to destroy food. Farmers went bankrupt. The economic cost was staggering, estimated at over $700 billion. The disaster's impact on the Soviet Union itself was profound. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, later wrote that Chernobyl was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union, even more than his reforms. The disaster exposed the lies and incompetence at the heart of the Soviet system. It showed the world that the supposedly superior Soviet technology was deeply flawed. It broke the trust between the government and its people. The economic burden of dealing with Chernobyl helped bankrupt the Soviet Union. The international humiliation damaged Soviet prestige. And the revelation that authorities had lied about the disaster, had sent people into contaminated areas without protection, had hidden information while radiation spread across Europe, destroyed whatever moral authority the Communist Party still had. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone remains largely abandoned. About 200 people, mostly elderly, have returned to live in the zone illegally. They prefer to die in their homes rather than live elsewhere. Wildlife has taken over. Wolves, wild horses, bears, and other animals now populate areas where humans once lived. The radiation affects them. Birth defects, mutations, higher mortality rates. But life persists. The abandoned city of Pripyat has become a haunting tourist destination. Tour operators offer day trips through the ghost town. You can see schools with textbooks still on desks. Apartments with belongings left behind. The amusement park with its rusty Ferris wheel that never opened. Gas masks scattered on floors. It's a time capsule of Soviet life, frozen at the moment everyone fled. In 2016, a new protective structure called the New Safe Confinement was completed. This massive arch, taller than the Statue of Liberty, was slid into place over the old sarcophagus. It's designed to contain the reactor for 100 years while the slow process of decommissioning begins. The cleanup is expected to take until 2065 or beyond. And even then, the area won't be safe for human habitation for thousands of years. The radioactive fuel and debris inside Reactor 4, including the elephant's foot, a mass of corium that formed in the basement, remains intensely radioactive. In the first days after the disaster, the elephant's foot was so radioactive that standing near it for 5 minutes would be fatal. Standing near it for 30 seconds would cause dizziness and fatigue. 2 minutes would cause cells to hemorrhage. 5 minutes meant certain death within days. Today, decades later, it's still dangerous though less immediately lethal. The lessons of Chernobyl reshaped nuclear power worldwide. Safety culture improved. Reactor designs were re-evaluated. The RBMK design was recognized as fundamentally flawed. International cooperation on nuclear safety increased. But the disaster also fueled global anti-nuclear movements. Many countries reconsidered or abandoned nuclear power programs. The human stories from Chernobyl are countless and heartbreaking. Vasily Ignatenko was one of the first firefighters on scene. His wife Lyudmila was pregnant. She visited him in the hospital as he died from acute radiation syndrome, ignoring warnings that she was exposing herself and her unborn child to radiation from his contaminated body. Their daughter was born 4 hours after birth with multiple deformities and died. Lyudmila survived, haunted by guilt and grief. Valery Legasov was the Soviet nuclear physicist who led the investigation into the disaster. He testified about what really happened, admitting Soviet design flaws and operator errors. He fought to get the truth out. 2 years after the disaster, on April 26, 1988, the second anniversary, Legasov hanged himself. He left behind audio tapes detailing everything he knew about Chernobyl and Soviet nuclear safety issues. His death and testimony eventually contributed to reforms. The disaster affected millions of lives across the contaminated regions. Children exposed to radiation developed thyroid cancer at dramatically elevated rates. Families were torn apart by evacuations. Entire ways of life were destroyed. People in affected areas still struggle with contamination in their food, water, and environment. The disaster continues, 39 years later. Chernobyl stands as a monument to human fallibility, to the dangers of cutting corners on safety, to the consequences of lies and cover-ups, to the price of hubris, but also to human courage and sacrifice, to the firefighters who went knowingly into lethal radiation to save others, to the liquidators who worked in impossible conditions to contain the disaster, to the scientists and engineers who gave years of their lives to clean up the mess. The accident that the nuclear industry said could never happen, happened. And when it did, it proved that nuclear power, for all its benefits, carries risks unlike any other technology. A single mistake, a flawed design, incompetent management, can create a disaster that lasts not years but millennia. That contaminates not a city but a continent. That kills not dozens but thousands. And that changes history itself. Reactor 4 still sits under its containment structure, a tomb for the worst nuclear disaster in human history. A monument to 3.6 Roentgen. To the 7 seconds between pressing a button and destroying a reactor. To the bridge of death and the ghost city and the forest that turned red. To the liquidators and the firefighters and the 3 men in the basement. To the 31 acknowledged dead and the thousands more who died later. To Chernobyl. The accident that was never supposed to happen. But did.